The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, what you should know before crossing the border into Donald Trump's America. Then, why are security clearances an issue in this federal election campaign? That's ahead on the agenda. High-profile cases of visitors to the United States being denied entry or detained have Canadians concerned about traveling south. How worried should travelers be, and what do we need to know about the risks and your rights? Let's find out from, in Waterloo, Ontario, Kelly McClinchy, instructor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University, and a board member with the Travel and Tourism Research Association Canada chapter. And here in our studios, Heather Siegel, founding partner of Siegel Immigration Law, and Brett Carraway, associate professor in the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information and Technology at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Welcome to you both in studio.
Thank you.
And Kelly for joining us on the line. All right, let's start. Kelly, I'm going to come to you first. We've all seen the recent stories of foreign travelers being denied entry or detained. Is any of this actually new?
It's a great question. I think what we have to realize is that we've had issues at our borders for quite some time with respect to immigration concerns, especially at the U.S.-Mexico border and with certain travelers traveling across into Canada from the U.S. What we're noticing right now is that we're hearing these stories more in mainstream media, and we're noticing that some of these delays and detainments are occurring with travelers that frequently travel across the border, those that are traveling in particular for holidaying, vacationing with families. It seems to be happening more often, and we notice that it's happening with travelers that are traveling very frequently, that have never had problems before, that have traveled with their visas and their ESTAs and so on, and with updated documentation. So what we're noticing is that this seems to be happening more often, and there is quite a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not people are going to be questioned at the border. And so it is something I think that as Canadians we're extremely concerned about, and we've noticed that with respect to some of the data that we've been collecting in terms of cross-border travel.
All right, I want to talk legal. Tell me what's changed, because legally, not much. But there seems to be lots of, as Kelly has sort of described, lots of movement there.
100%. Legally, not a lot has changed. That's absolutely true. But what people don't understand and what they don't realize is that there has been a paradigm shift in the United States. And the sooner that people catch up and understand that, the sooner they're going to shift their perspective. Our relationship with the United States is changing, and as a result of that, the adjudications are changing. My experience has been, in the 30 years that I've been doing U.S. immigration law, is that the folks at the border, Customs and Border Protection, take their cues from the top. And so when the president is in a greater period of isolationism or xenophobia, then that translates down to the border folks who are more inclined to say, we have a problem, we don't like what's going on. They always had the discretion. To Kelly's point, they've always had the authority to do it. It's just that now they're using that authority and the discretion in a way that they never have.
Okay. Brett, is it actually riskier, or is it a fear related mostly to those headlines that we've been talking about?
If you look at the data that the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Agency provides, at least for last year, the amount of searches, for example, of electronic devices is still pretty low. It's about 0.01%.
Okay.
So it's low. But if you blow that up into the actual numbers, that's about 47,000 people who are crossing that border that have been stopped for something more than, basic questioning. I think it's probably a lot of increased sensitivity by media, because there's a lot of discourse coming from the United States that is undermining the notion of Canadian sovereignty. I think I agree with what Heather is saying, that there's also a change in culture in law enforcement that is a reflection of a change in priority from the executive branch on down. There's a lot of anecdotes that I haven't heard before where they're looking for things like anti-Semitic communications, talking about looking at people's social media posts. It's true, you've never had many rights at the border.
Right.
If any at all. I mean, your only real right is to try and walk away and say, I'm okay, I don't want to go into the United States. And you still might be detained for a while. But those laws haven't changed, but the way in which the laws are being enacted upon by law enforcement, I think, has shifted.
All right. The government of Canada recently updated its travel advisory for the U.S. and it reads, U.S. authorities strictly enforce entry requirements. Expect scrutiny at ports of entry, including of electronic devices. Comply and be forthcoming in all interactions with border authorities. If you are denied entry, you could be detained while awaiting deportation. Of course, that from the government of Canada. Heather, what does this tell you? The fact that the government decided to spell this out.
So that's really interesting, because I think what people need to understand about travel advisories is that there is a large political component to them. And so sometimes they are about, don't go to certain areas of Ukraine because you might get blown up, which is a safety thing and concern for Canadians. But this is a statement to the Canadian public about what's going on in the United States. They threatened us with tariffs. They are concerned about letting certain kinds of people in. And Canada's value system is very different and doesn't like that. And so we made a statement that actually doesn't say substantively a lot of difference of anything that's ever occurred in the past. You could always had to be careful about your electronics, and you always had to obey the rules and be honest and forthright. This is not news. What's news is that the Canadian government made a choice to say, we are concerned about what's going on in the United States. And in fact, Denmark and Finland and Germany have also made statements, and I believe there was another country today. So I think what we're seeing is a reaction of the world politically, to some degree, concerned about what's happening in the United States as manifest in their immigration.
Kelly, I want to get your take on that as well.
I just wanted to come back to that question and comment before about risk, because I think it does have something to do with these travel warnings that are coming out in terms of the Canadian government and other governments as well issuing these warnings. It wasn't until maybe a week or two ago where we started to see these warnings come out, especially with regards to Canada. The only warning that was on the Government of Canada website before that point was the one in regards to those staying longer than 30 days to make sure that you have issued the proper travel documentation, that they were going to be checking for that. So some of these warnings are coming about quite rapidly, but I want to just come back to that comment about risk. What we're noticing right now is that, yes, we've always had these warnings being issued by our government with regards to traveling in different destinations. What's a little bit surprising is that we're now seeing these warnings come from the U.S. or for the United States. As Canadians, we've always been very privileged to be able to travel. Most of us have been very privileged to be able to travel very fluidly, having ease of mobility across the border. And so to see these warnings come out kind of instigates that perception of fear of travel to the United States. And we also have to be aware of the fact that when we see these warnings, it affects our image of that destination. So it, gives us that sensation that we should be concerned about traveling to that destination, that we're a little nervous, and that we may therefore decide not to travel. So there's a difference in how we mitigate risk and how we mediate risk in terms of our travel decision making. And our perceptions of risk can affect whether or not we decide to travel to that destination. And so we're seeing that definitely in the numbers, those statistics across the border. So approximately 30% of Canadians are choosing not to travel across land borders into the U.S., for example, 30% reduction. We're seeing that about 13% fewer Canadians are traveling by air into the United States. So this is coming across in some actual data that Statistics Canada and other organizations have been collecting right now.
All right. Brett, I want to talk a little bit about sort of when we get to the border. We talked about phones a little bit, but I'm curious, do border guards need a reason to search your phone? Is there, when we get there, Well, I'm thinking similar to getting pulled over by a police officer, needing reasons for anything. But as you mentioned, there's not a lot of rights at that border. Do they need a reason to search your phone?
I'll let Heather correct me if I'm wrong
Yeah,
about
here we
anything
go.
that I say here. No, my understanding is that there's no need for probable cause in this. There's no need for a warrant. It's at the discretion of the Customs and Border Protection agent. That's why I say to people, when you show up at a land border in particular, if you're in Pearson, Toronto Pearson Airport, that's a pre-screening area. It's a little bit harder for them to detain you, although they potentially could. Most likely if they found something they were concerned about, they would try and turn you over to, I'm assuming, the Toronto law enforcement. But if you're at a land border, once you've crossed a river or a border, you're on U.S. jurisdiction at that point. You're in U.S. jurisdiction. And you can refuse to answer questions. You can refuse to hand over your phone or passwords. But that might result in you not only being turned away, but detained, have your device taken away from you, and potentially be put into detainment yourself.
Let's pick up on that because I am curious about the passwords. That was one thing, we've got these 4, PIN passwords or 6 PIN passwords. Can we give our phone over and just be like, here we are?
Well, a couple of things I want to say. It's true. They have wide discretion and latitude to make decisions about whether or not they're going to investigate your phone. And there is a diminished right. There's a diminished right to privacy, if there is any privacy at a border, because you're subjecting yourself to enter an international area, another country, and they have to do their due diligence to make sure you're not bringing in anything illegal. So if they do choose to search your phone, they do need some reason. Maybe they're concerned you're going to be working in the United States. The very first question you get when you cross the border is, what's the purpose of your visit? And they're looking to see if you're going to be working. The other thing they're looking is, how long are you staying? Which is, are you going to be living permanently in the United States? And so they need some reason to tell you that they have some concern, and in their discretion, they might be worried that you are going to be doing one of these illegal things, and they need to do a deeper dive, and therefore they need to look at your electronics. But to Brett's point, it's very easy to come up with that reason, and in your discretion, you can take the electronics and ask to see them in order to find out whether or not, in fact, your assumptions are true. In terms of the passwords, if you want to enter the United States, you must give them the password. And that is true. If you are at a land port of entry and you don't give them the password, they will take your phone and they'll send it into a more advanced search where they can have other people figure out your passwords in the American government. Whereas that's true at the Canadian, at pre-flight inspection, because you're on Canadian soil, you can always say, you know what, I'm not interested in traveling today. I want to withdraw my application, and you can leave. Now, you will probably have difficulty getting back in the next time. However, you can take your device, and that gets you out of the situation with the passwords.
Okay. I want to follow up with Brett. Talking about devices, I want to talk about burners, because that has been coming up lately. I don't know if you heard, but the executives of CHEO, Children's Hospital of Eastern Ontario, recommended, if you can avoid traveling to the U.S., that's one thing, but possibly bringing a burner phone with you. Does a burner phone make sense?
My concern would be that it would raise suspicion if you had a phone that was, say, completely wiped, or just like a flip phone or something like that didn't have any of your text messages on it. But I don't think it runs afoul of anything. I think it's kind of a situation where you would just have to make a decision about what you think the level of risk would be, what your interaction with a particular border agent would be. I think, to Heather's point, most of the time that I've heard of people having their devices searched, this comes as part of an escalation based on some sort of initial interaction that has raised concern.
Is there a red flag that they're looking for? Is there something that's with the questions that they're looking for? Is there something that's So they're looking for, yeah.
Well, I mean, their issues that fall underneath their mission include everything from, human trafficking to child porn to, I think, I would assume that a lot of this has to do with concern that maybe people are violating the terms of their entry visa. But again, speaking to this shift that's happening in the politics here, is that now I'm starting to hear things about, well, we have concerns that maybe you're engaging in anti-Semitic activity or things like that. Most of this is still anecdotal, so I can't make any generalized comment about that, but there is concern that maybe the purview is, there's a little bit of mission creep going on right now.
All right.
I just wanted to add a couple of things. Number one, there's been a statement by the U.S. government that says there's only two genders and it's the one you had at birth.
Right.
So people who are trans, I'm getting tons of calls from trans people, and they can expect that they might have problems if their passport gender does not reflect their sex at birth. That could be a problem for them. There's about 43 countries that are on the precipice of being on a new ban list. So if you are a Canadian, potentially born in Iran, you might have a problem crossing the border, and they might want to look at your electronics, even if you don't have there's no indication that you're going to be working in the United States. So these are groups of people that I'd be concerned about. And with respect to the burner phone, I actually am of the view that American Immigration Lawyers Association and the Canadian Bar Association have said that it's a good idea to not travel with anything that's protected. Now, these are lawyers association, but if you have protected private information, I was making a joke earlier that, you wouldn't travel with your medical records or your bank statements, which are all on your phone. So why would you take anything else? And I bet you there will be a trend now to have people take travel phones, and it will be their travel phone. And so we don't call it a burner, and therefore there will be no expectation that anything else is there. And if there's suspicions, there's going to be suspicions. People make choices about what they're willing to share with other people at an international border, and I don't put in my luggage pieces of paper that I think I don't want anyone else to see, and similarly I wouldn't carry anything on my technology that I don't want anyone else to see. And I think that's acceptable.
Okay. Kelly, I am curious, are there different risks associated with different forms of travel, if we're traveling by land versus air?
Yeah, you make a really good point, and it was alluded to earlier with Brett in terms of, being in those customs clearance areas in airports with regards to land borders. So as I said, crossing land borders, there's been situations where people have been questioned with regards to their motivations for travel. Certainly there are cases where, we know as certain Canadians may be asked or even interrogated more at these borders with respect to some of their motivations for travel across land borders. And some of those are what we're noticing, that more stories are coming out where people have been interrogated or questioned at land borders as opposed to detained at airports in these pre-customs areas in terms of Canadians' experience. There are stories coming out from those traveling Europeans. So the example of the German traveler, the person from the UK, the French academic who was trying to get into the United States for a conference, they were stopped in terms of air travel. But so in the past, there's probably been more situations of these occurrences happening at land borders. But I think what we're noticing is that some of these stories are happening more frequently, both at air crossings or in these customs clearance areas and at land borders. I also wanted to bring up that issue that was discussed earlier in regards to like the burner phones and the checking of information. There are stories coming out from travelers coming into the United States, especially internationally as well, in terms of being checked and asked some of those detailed questions about bank statements, in terms of their some of their employment history, in terms of some of these details that is, whether it's available on their phone or whether being asked for some further in-depth questioning because of some of their documentation. So if they're traveling with regards to an ESTA or a work visa, it might be expected now that some of those deeper questions are going to be asked based on those motivations for travel. So if folks are planning on traveling into the U.S. with some of these other types of visas or visa waiver documentation, that they might be further questioned and maybe being asked to check some of these further paperwork behind some of their stories.
All right, Brett, I want to come to you. Heather had mentioned getting calls from trans people who were concerned about going over to the border. But I want to talk about another specific group. You're in the classroom a lot, and so they're students. We were talking about visas and paperwork. What are you hearing from your students about potentially crossing over to the border and their fears?
So I spoke with a grad student of mine several days ago, and he is Syrian-born, Canadian, and concerned about the ability to cross that border safely to go do conferences or whatever you might need to do as a grad student in the United States. I'm also hearing from faculty who have concerns about crossing the border. A lot of the discourse tends to be about maybe people who have immigrated to Canada from Muslim majority countries and a fear of what might happen, a fear of being detained as they try and gain access to the United States across a land border in particular. The university itself has sort of just reiterated what we've all known has been well, maybe not all of us, but those of us who pay attention have known the legal statuses when you're crossing the border. And then the university has also partnered with an organization, I think it's called SOS International, where you can download an app and log in through their website portal to gain essentially support in emergency situations and logistics. But it's sort of a developing discourse at this point.
All right. Heather, I am curious. If we're denied at the border, what's our recourse? What can we do?
Well, it depends on why you're denied at the border.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So, I mean, if they think you have a criminal record and you don't, you have to prove to them, and in fact, you don't. It's hard to prove a negative, but you can sometimes do it. And you should, so it's, what I think is really important to back up and then answer this in conjunction is, the reason people are getting asked the questions at the borders is because immigration is enforcing the rules that already exist. And previously there was an assumption that people are always telling the truth. And now there's this attitude of highly suspicious of everybody coming in, which mirrors the president's position, the administration's position. And so my advice is, never hand your phone over. Print your boarding pass when you're doing pre-flight inspection. Bring your documents. Show the hotel you're staying in. Bring a letter from your employer if you need to show that you're employed in Canada, that you're not going to be working in the United States. And don't bring any papers that you don't want them to see. The reasons they ask for financial or background or evidence of having some kind of ties to Canada is to prove you're not going to stay in the United States permanently. So one of the biggest reasons people do get denied, there's two big reasons. One is because they think somebody's going to be working in the United States and they say, go get yourself a work permit. Or they say, we think you're living in the United States and prove to us that you're not. So you can sometimes be invited to go back to the United States with, or try and reapply to get in with evidence of whatever the concerns were. So that's one, probably the most usual way that things go. But I think it's really important for people to understand why they're being denied, because sometimes they walk away and they don't understand. And you can say to an immigration officer, hey, I just want to understand why you're not allowing me in, and is there anything I can do to help the situation next time? And they'll tell you, and maybe it's accurate and maybe it's inaccurate, but at least you're coming with a piece of information and a direction to go. There is an admissibility review officer at Pearson, for example, and all the ports of entry across the world have a review officer, and they can look at whether or not everything was done properly. The way Customs and Border Protection functions is very hierarchical, and there's deference to the level above. So there is always someone you can talk to. Now, whether that person is going to be amenable or facilitative, it's hard to know, but in terms of the question, what can you do? There are things you can do. Now, this is easy if you walk away at an airport. If you're at a land port of entry and you're detained, the information is that you cannot leave. You're stuck till they let you out, and it's been very hard. I mean, they moved that woman, the Canadian woman, to Louisiana because that's the jurisdiction that is the toughest on immigration. But that's old news too. I mean, when they arrest people and they put them into deportation or put them into questioning or detain them, they often send them to different parts of the United States that are beneficial. So that's not news.
I am curious, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but anecdotally I've heard people being asked by border agents their thoughts. Right? Their opinions on what's happening. What do they think about being the 51st state? What are their thoughts on Donald Trump? What's your advice to sort of answering that question and making sure that they can go on and have their vacation or their trip or wherever they're going?
Good question. What do you think? I mean, my thoughts don't belong to anybody. They're my thoughts, and I don't need to share them. This is not confession. So it is not a legal requirement to answer that. And maybe I don't have any thoughts. So the question assumes I have thoughts about this subject matter. And I think that we can answer questions to convey to immigration that we are legal and reliable and are going to be upstanding and we are not going to cause trouble in the United States. And I think those are the issues they're looking for. And even if some of their value systems right now don't align with ours as Canadians, we can still be honest. And at the end of the day, they get the discretion with respect to whether or not they're going to let us in. So you can only be honest and forthright and answer the questions you're asked. And don't start offering, and last week I was at my grandmother's. Nobody cares. Nobody needs to know. It's just, the facts.
All right. We have less than a minute left, and I have a question for each of you. Kelly, I am curious, do you think that when Trump's term is over, tourism and travel, you talked about the numbers being down, will they return to normal or even in his term?
That's a really great question. If we look back in the pandemic era, when the borders were forcibly closed and people had an intense fear of travel due to COVID-19, we all thought that what's going to happen to travel? Tourism was at a standstill and many economies suffered, and there was an intense concern about travel at that time, and we wondered, will it bounce back? And what we noticed was it started out with a small trickle, and as we noticed that there was, of course, perceived fear, but as soon as we realized that our objective fear was we were sort of diffusing that a little bit, travel bounced back. And although in some cases it's not in the pre-pandemic levels that it was, we're noticing that some destinations are now experiencing over-tourism. And so I do believe that, travel and tourism, people have a desire to travel, whether it is for business or conferences or certainly for vacationing and holidaying, that we do have this intense desire to move and to go places. And I do see that perhaps as we notice that some of this perceived fear is perhaps a little bit more extensive or more medium risk or perhaps less risk than it is, that maybe we'll still travel. In that sense, I do see that as we notice that some of that risk is less, that we'll start seeing travel open up. And I certainly do believe that with what's happening in terms of our geopolitical issues with the U.S. right now, that it might be a slow start, but I think once that term ceases, perhaps, that we will see a return to travel like we have before.
All right, Brett, you get the last word here. I understand that you might be traveling to the States soon. I'm just curious, what kinds of precautions will you be taking?
Well, I'm a dual citizen who is stubborn in driving all the way from Toronto down to Texas multiple times a year. So I get a very interesting swath of the U.S. on my drive down. I think I'll be taking a lot of the precautions that I would be if I wasn't a dual citizen, actually. I think I will. I crossed with a U.S. passport, but irrespective of that, I think I will lessen the amount of data I have on my phone. I think I will go through my texts and see, is there anything that I think is problematic there? I'll go through my apps and ask myself, do I need all of these apps stored on the phone? I'll look at my photos and decide, is there anything in here that I might not want someone to see? And just sort of think, what is my tolerance in terms of having my privacy impinged upon by the U.S. jurisdiction?
All right, we're going to leave it there. Heather, Brett, Kelly, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Really informative stuff. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Security clearances have become a flashpoint in the federal election campaign, with Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre standing by his decision to forego vetting. So, who needs a security clearance? What's involved in getting one? And what are the practical implications of going without? Let's find out from, in the nation's capital, Wesley Wark, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation and a Fellow with the Basili School of International Affairs. Welcome, Wesley.
Thanks very much for having me on the program, Jay.
All right, let's start with the basics. What exactly is a security clearance?
So a security clearance gives right of access to primarily federal civil servants right of access to classified information. There are different levels of security clearances. They can also apply to a very select group of politicians, and they can apply, of course, to contractors who are working on classified projects. So it's a pretty wide pool of people that can require a security clearance. But as I say, the key to it is understanding that there are many different levels. And it is something that for many people, certainly working for the government or close to the government, is an absolute requirement of their job.
Well, I want to pick up on that specifically about who needs to get one. We're talking about federal employees, politicians. You talked about the varying sort of degrees of clearance. Break that down for me a little bit.
Sure. So the highest level clearance is now called top secret enhanced. There's a new sort of policy that was put in place in the mid 2010s to define these different levels. So at the very top, top secret enhanced. And that can include special, what is often called compartmented information that has its own code words attached to it. So top secret enhanced code word is at the stratospheric level. Below that is more standard top secret. Below that, secret. Below that, a clearance called reliable, which is where everyone starts. And it's typically the place where, for example, like a summer student coming in to work in the government in some department and agency would require reliable. But for access to any of the more sensitive information, the leakage of which or disclosure of which could do some harm to Canada, that's generally at the secret or top secret level.
Okay. Break it down a little. What kinds of information get classified as top secret?
Well, that's a good question. So there's really it's operational intelligence. It's intelligence that comes to us from our allies. It's intelligence that comes through special channels in terms of how it's collected, perhaps signals intelligence or intelligence provided by a human informant working inside or alongside some group, say a terrorist group of interest. So it's very special kinds of intelligence get that top secret label attached to it, and that really just reflects the sensitivity of the information and the damage that could be done if it's disclosed in an unauthorized way.
I imagine that a lot of people, when they hear security clearance, they're thinking of all the movies they've watched where, everyone is rushing into a boardroom. It is the elites of the elites in a room. Everyone is really tense, and there's information, being spread. And I'm curious, I know you've been in some of those kind of security clearances, and I'm curious, how or where do politicians review top secret information? Does it look exactly like the movies that I'm watching?
Well, no, not exactly, inevitably, Jay, and alas for the drama of it. When it comes to politicians, and we're talking primarily about cabinet ministers, for example, or the prime minister, when a politician has access to top secret information, they can only be given that material if it's in written form or briefed on it orally in a special kind of setting. It's usually called a SCIF. There are many acronyms, of course, in the intelligence world. That one stands for Secure Compartmented Information Facility. So it's essentially a room, often a pretty small room, which is guarded against any exfiltration of signals or any kind of incoming efforts to access whatever is going on in that room. The room is swept for bugs. It's electronically monitored, so it's meant to be very secure. And this is all just, again, to protect the information. But for politicians, of course, and that would include, for example, officials in the Prime Minister's office and perhaps some senior aides, whenever they have to be briefed on top secret information, it often comes with a real kind of annoyance factor to it, in the sense that anyone going into a SCIF or a secure compartmented information facility has to leave every electronic device behind. Any kind of mobile device, if you have some kind of smartwatch, anything that emits a signal and could be used in a sophisticated way to tap into a conversation, all of that is left behind. So as you can imagine, for busy politicians, cabinet ministers, prime minister, busy staffers, they hate being without their devices, hate being disconnected in the kinds of ways that you have to be when you get access to this information.
As I mentioned, I understand that you have had top secret clearance. I guess I'm going to ask this question. I'm going to assume the answer. You're not going to tell me, but what was the clearance for?
Well, the clearance was for a special project I was asked to do for the Privy Council office. It was a history of the Canadian intelligence community, trying to kind of track its evolution since the end of the Second World War into the Cold War. And that required my own access to, all of the archival records and historical records about the community, many of which remained highly classified, some of which involved Allied reporting and policy discussions with Canada. So a lot of the material was classified at secret, top secret code word. And so I needed that clearance to have access to that. But having the clearance also, when I had any kind of need to know, as other officials determined it, allowed me to take part in some other kind of policy and intelligence discussions.
That sounds like very important stuff. But I have to imagine there is there's a part of you that must think that's pretty cool. I don't know if you get a badge of it saying, top secret, enhanced, top secret enhanced, but it must be pretty cool to get that kind of clearance.
Well, I mean, it's certainly to have access to some very special, channels and of reporting is certainly a privilege, and it is, cool in that sense. You're not supposed to tell anyone about this level of security clearance you have, and in fact, you're meant to. In many of the agencies, you're meant to even hide the fact that you have an entrance badge. So there's secrecy around the fact that you have access to secrets. It is a privilege. It's also a daunting process. It must be said, for many people going through the security clearance process. And with the revisions to the process that took place after a famous spy case in Canada, the Jeffrey Delisle case, it's now a matter of form that anyone working, for example, at any of our key intelligence collection agencies, CSIS, for example, or the Communication Security Establishment, you have to go through a polygraph exam, which was not the case when I had a top secret clearance. And I'm sure polygraph exams are particularly nerve-wracking.
Right. I want to pick up on that and understand actually who is doing the actual vetting, what are they looking for specifically, and who decides whether someone passes or fails?
Sure. So good questions, Jane. I mean, and I think little understood by Canadians who haven't gone through the process. So the agency that is responsible for doing security clearances, that is checking all the information about an applicant for a security clearance, is the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. And on an annual basis, they have to deal with a very high volume of security clearance requests. So CSIS does that, is engaged in that process. And it's up to CSIS to make a recommendation. They don't have a final determining say, but they make a recommendation to what is called the deputy head or deputy minister of a department or agency for which a person is employed. And the recommendation will say, this person passes the vetting process, or that there are serious kind of signs of concern about this person, and the deputy head should perhaps determine that that person should not have a security clearance. So it's a process of advice. The test that's involved, and there are many different kinds of forms of information that go into these tests. The test is really twofold. Is a person deemed reliable in terms of their workplace behavior? And perhaps more importantly, is a person deemed loyal? And if you think about that element of the security clearance is probably pretty obvious, but loyalty would involve things like associations with foreign partners and powers that might be of concern, concerning travel history, having relatives still living in authoritarian states where authoritarian state might put pressure on those relatives that would impact on a particular individual. So loyalty is probably the key test. Reliability is really just determined, is important in the sense that they want to make sure that there aren't signs of kind of abnormal or odd behavior in a person's work past or, even educational past.
If we're talking about loyalty, I think there's one position in this country that a lot of people would assume is loyal to the nation. It's the Prime Minister. And I'm curious, do Prime Ministers automatically receive security clearance?
The answer is more or less yes, and they go through a different process. And it's not just the Prime Minister, it's also anyone who's appointed as a cabinet minister. All such individuals are deemed to be what's called privy councillors. This is an old practice linked back to practice in the UK Parliament. If you are appointed to one of these positions, you become a privy councillor, you have special rights and privileges. You do go through a kind of minimal form of security vetting, but it's not anything like as intensive as would normally be required for the kind of access to information that a minister or a prime minister would have. And certainly, for example, we don't polygraph cabinet ministers or the prime minister. So there is a vetting process, but it's a little bit more minimal than is required for many federal civil servants.
Obviously, we're talking about this with the federal election happening, and a lot of this being some members and some leaders who did not want to have that access. Have opposition leaders always had access to security clearances? And I am curious, with the parties that we have here, with the NDP, the Greens, the Bloc, do they have clearance as well?
Yeah, so first part of the question is important, I think, to understand. The idea of a government offering security clearances, high-level security clearances to opposition party leaders in the House of Commons is a pretty new development. It's not standard practice. It's really come about in the context of all the controversy over foreign interference. And it was first offered to allow opposition party leaders to see the classified annex to the report that David Johnson, when he was serving as independent special rapporteur, delivered. There was a public report, it was a classified annex, and the government said, well, we'd like opposition party leaders to have the opportunity to read that classified annex and have a better sense of what David Johnson found. And, many opposition leaders, including from the NDP and the Greens, took up that opportunity. This goes back to the spring of 2023. At that time, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, of course, determined that he did not want a security clearance. And I think it's probably important to understand the kind of political context of that decision at the time. And that was that the Conservative Party in particular was adamantly opposed to the kind of process that had established the independent special rapporteur. They were really pushing for a public, or what we would understand as a judicial inquiry, which ultimately came about. So I think there was a kind of political reason in the moment for Pierre Poilievre to refuse that security clearance. But then he was, I think it's fair to say, locked into that decision and hasn't found a way to, find an exit ramp from it. So he continues to say he doesn't want a security clearance. The reason he gives is that he doesn't want to have his lips sealed.
A gag order. That's essentially his words, yeah.
Yeah, because of this access to classified information.
I'm curious, on that note, do you find the rationale persuasive enough? I know, as you mentioned, a little politicized, but him calling it a gag order?
Yeah, I don't find it persuasive at all. Let me be very frank about that. And I think that's a view shared by many people who have had security clearances and been involved in policy making with national security or intelligence implications. And the reason why I say it's not persuasive is that one has to make a distinction between the absolute requirement for anyone with a high-level security clearance receiving classified information. You have, of course, to protect that information. You can't divulge its details. But that's a very different thing from saying you can't learn from the access to briefings or documents that you might have with a security clearance. And the learning piece is the important piece, I think. It's not the details, but it's the learning piece. And from the perspective of any major opposition party, I think there is a real need in this day and age of geopolitical threats and domestic threats and foreign interference threats and so on for any opposition party leader who wants to fashion an independent policy stance around these issues, wants to make sure that his own caucus maintains its integrity, against various kinds of threats. Very important to understand the threat environment, and that's what a security clearance can give you. Of course, your lips are sealed about the details, but your mind is not sealed from learning and applying those lessons to your own policy platforms and to your own leadership.
Leslie, I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. That was really, really informative stuff. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Jane.
I grew up in Rexdale from kindergarten to 6th grade, and one of the things that really made me love the neighborhood was how connected it was to civic services.
I think the library has been most helpful, and here is the library that you have an open space. There is a lot of sunshine here, and there is a particular portion I like to stay to just absorb the sunlight.
I like the staff. They're knowledgeable, they're friendly, you feel welcome.
I think Rexdale exists in such an isolated corner of the city that a lot of people don't get to appreciate how tightly knit our communities actually are. When I was growing up there were Jamaicans, Latin communities, there was a large Sikh community as well that was coming up, Italians, and diversity is our strength is not something that just exists in the core of the city, it's everywhere. And despite not having the same resources like a connected subway system, we still function quite well out there.
So on this side, we have the shared circulation and reference desk, where customers can come and get help either with checkouts, ask reference questions, kind of just talk to staff. And then straight ahead of us, across from the shared desk, is we have the self-checkouts. So customers can come here once they've borrowed their items and they want to check them out. They can get straight to that, doing that themselves, or they can ask us for help at the circulation desk.
My name is Veronica Bosco. I'm the assistant branch head at Albion. I actually started working in libraries when I was in high school as a page. So I got to experience kind of like the library at that point, and I just fell in love with it because I got to, kind of see how necessary it was the community. So then once I graduated from my undergrad at U of T, I went to McGill and I got my master's of information studies. We're the district branch, so we are the biggest branch that's in our district. So we are definitely one of the busier branches. We have a lot of people who come in for tech help. We also just have a bunch of different services and service points, which is why we're busy. So for example, we have a library settlement partner, so called LSP for short. She works for the Rexdale Women's Center, so we have a partnership with them where she comes in and she provides services to newcomers. So they book appointments with her if people need help with citizenship, where they've just arrived and they need help accessing resources. She's the expert.
One of the reasons why newcomer services are important to libraries is because they give an opportunity to parents and children of immigrants to not only learn of Canadian culture, but to participate in it. One of the things that I love about the library is that you go to the front desk and they will work with you to figure out what you need. Whether or not it's in English, French, Spanish, they have the resources. You just have to figure out a better way of communicating when you don't share the same language. Ultimately, when we want to integrate newcomers into Canada, a place where there's no one set Canadian identity, we need to be able to share the different cultural resources that make you a part of the mosaic instead of trying to assimilate people into a one-size-fits-all view of how you should be. When you think about newcomer relationships, a lot of people don't think about how kids act as translators to get services for their parents while they're working or while they're in school. And it's really important that libraries have these services so that not only the kids can start to learn about English culture, what it means to be Canadian, but it also gives them an opportunity to be embedded into the community.
I can definitely appreciate the diversity. There are so many ethnic groups passing through here, so it's like a community feel. As an international student, I don't feel as if I don't belong. I see that persons from different walks of life are here also, so it's like a family setting.
We have people who come in to use our digital innovation space. We also have a youth hub, so it's one of TVL has a bunch of different youth hubs. They're an after-school program. Starts at 13, but they just go to belly roll. So it's an after-school program. We provide snacks, we provide video games, we provide different activities, and it's just a space where kids can go after school to feel safe. We always have staff in there, so mentorship, all of that.
So the youth hub that exists in Rexdale was a project that I worked on with the Toronto Youth Cabinet, and it was important to me to get a youth hub in the library because a lot of us kind of forget how important that transition, that puberty-filled transition from 12 to 18 is. You're not a kid anymore. You're learning how to become an adult, and if there's not designated spaces for that, you lack direction to decide your development. And one of the reasons I really push for that is because there's a lack of teenage spaces. There's a lack of narratives that are appropriate for coming of age. And it's because a lot of our media now just focuses on adult products. And without that space to negotiate what your growth will look like, we have a lot of teenagers just acting like adults before they're adults.
From what I understand, I just wish the city would focus more on libraries for more than thinking they're just libraries, is thinking of them as also pseudo rec centers in which if you put money into them, you could really engage a lot of neighborhoods, right? I know this Albion branch has a youth hub, the one directly behind you, that caters to the youth for the evening. And I really believe that if stuff like that is really pushed forward in places like this, that it's just beneficial for everybody.
Part of what makes the library great is providing these different resources to different people who might not have access, right? So right now you kind of can't exist in the world without having access to the internet. But also internet is expensive. People have, different means. There's different struggles, but you can't even essentially get a job at this point if you don't have access to the internet. So one of the things that TPL does is we have what's called the Wi-Fi hotspot program, which we lend out mobile hotspot devices, and people are able to borrow them for a period of 6 months. So the way the project works right now is we get referrals from different community agencies who kind of do the vetting for us. They essentially just give us a name, and they're like, this person needs a hotspot device, and I'm like, all right, we can put them on the list. Part of the reason why, usage is going up is I think people recognize that, and they recognize that honestly, the library is just a really important third space where you can go and not have to spend money.
My name is Sonia Chima. I am one of the children's librarians here at Albion. I have been working here for almost 10 years, but I've been in the system for about 16 years. And I do many children's programming. I go out for outreaches to the daycares, Allions, and to the schools.
We have the children's nonfiction, children's fiction on that side. We also have Leading to Reading, which is where we have volunteers who come in to practice with children who need help reading. We have English materials as well as multilingual children's. So we have the children's computers, and we also have a roller coaster. So what this is that we have this set out all the time. So children are able to take the pieces, build them together to make a roller coaster. One of my favorite things is this big light bright wall. You can change these different colors, so you can use them to make different images. It's fun for kids, it's also fun for adults, like me.
What's unique about Albion Library and the community that it is culturally diverse. It's very passionate, engaging, and very appreciative of all the services that Albion Library offers. Patrons of all ages come to the library to attend the library programs. They also frequently visit the library, whether to borrow library items, to socialize, or to study. And it's just that staff cares, and the community knows. They know when they come to the library, they are struggling with something, whether it's related to a computer or anything else, they will come, and they know that they can rely on us. And because of that, there's an unfeigned mutual respect between the staff and the community members. This is the heart of the Albion community. When this library was being renovated, they did not close down the old building because the community wants the library. That's how important the library was. So while this new building was being constructed, the old building was still up and running. I think we only closed down for a few weeks to transfer everything from the old building to the new building, but it was just that's how important the Albion Library is for the community.
There's a reported rise in violence in Toronto libraries. Between 2022 and 2023, incidences of violence were up 71%. What do you attribute that to?
I'm not surprised that it's happening because you have a lot of people experiencing sickness, whether that's social isolation, substance abuse, congregating in one area and not getting help for that need. So it's really disheartening because the people that have to deal with it is the library staff. We can't get the police involved until violence happens. So it really puts everyone at odds with each other and it creates an environment of mistrust. So it's not surprising, but it's a consequence of us constantly devaluing social services, social workers, people that work in care systems.
Toronto Public Library's Safety and Security Update from January 2025 addresses the violence issue in this way. After several years of significant increases, the number of safety and security-related incidents at branches leveled off in 2024. In 2024, Toronto Public Library, TPL, continued to invest additional funds in safe and welcoming spaces initiatives, including library safety specialists, guards, security and surveillance systems, and other resources. These steps are having a tangible, positive impact in branches across TPL. Working in partnership with TPL staff, union, and other stakeholders, TPL will continue to implement further actions in 2025 to foster safe and welcoming space at all library locations.
The library should support the school. The school should support the healthcare centers. It's a connected web that requires that we advocate for each other's needs in wages, equipment, and just future investment in growing these spaces. So I would really hope that Ontarians, when we think about what we value, it's not just our property taxes and our property value, it's the seeds that we'll plant for the trees that our kids will sit under.
That is the agenda for Tuesday, April 15th, 2025. Tomorrow on the program, 3 former speechwriters join us to discuss the art of political speechwriting. I'm Jan Jagannathan. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.